Before iron stoves, before glass windows, before insulation as we understand it today, Norse households faced winters that could kill quietly and without warning. Temperatures plunged well below freezing for months at a time. Storms sealed settlements under snow, and fuel had to be gathered and rationed with precision. Yet archaeological remains show wooden Viking structures surviving decades longer than later medieval buildings exposed to milder climates. This was not luck, and it was not brute force. It was technique. One of the most overlooked methods was a deliberate, controlled charring of wood that transformed ordinary timber into a barrier against cold, rot, moisture, and insects. This practice was so subtle that it left almost no written trace, yet it shaped how Viking homes endured winters that destroyed less prepared settlements. What follows is not legend or romantic folklore. It is a practical, repeatable system rooted in material science, refined by experience and quietly passed down through generations who could not afford failure. Why Viking builders understood that untreated wood was the enemy of winter. Fresh-cut timber is alive in a sense. It absorbs moisture, releases it unevenly, cracks as temperatures shift, and becomes food for fungi and insects. In winter climates, this cycle accelerates damage. Moisture freezes inside wood fibers, expands, and splits beams from the inside. Vikings noticed this long before microscopes or chemistry, you know. They observed that wood exposed to fire behaved differently. It absorbed less water, resisted decay, and, well, held heat longer once warmed. Rather than burning wood for fuel alone, they learned to burn it strategically. Charring was not accidental scorching. It was controlled surface carbonization. The outer layer of wood was heated just enough to convert cellulose into carbon without structural collapse. This thin, blackened shell sealed the interior like armor. How controlled charring changed the thermal behavior of Viking homes. Charred wood behaves differently in cold environments, you see. The carbonized surface becomes hydrophobic, meaning water beads, and runs off instead of soaking in. That single change dramatically reduced freeze damage. But more importantly, charred wood slowed heat exchange. Carbonized surfaces, you know, absorb and release heat more gradually than raw timber. Inside longhouses, hearths burned continuously during winter. Walls made from charred planks retained warmth longer overnight and resisted temperature swings that caused drafts. The result was not comfort as we define it today, but survivability. Fewer cold shocks meant less condensation, less mold, and far less structural movement. This mattered because Viking houses were often earth-bermed or turf-covered. Moisture was constant. Without charring, rot would have destroyed wall posts in a few seasons. So, let's talk about how Vikings applied charring to structural posts and exterior surfaces. Archaeological evidence from Norway, Iceland, and coastal Denmark shows that post bases and exterior wall boards were charred most heavily near ground contact. This was deliberate, not just some happy accident. Builders would place vertical posts over shallow pits, expose the lower section to flame, scrape away loose ash, and then set the post into the earth while it was still warm. The heat drove out internal moisture, and the carbon layer acted as a barrier against fungus. Exterior cladding boards, interestingly enough, were sometimes charred on one side only. The blackened surface faced outward, absorbing sunlight and repelling rain, while the interior face remained raw to better absorb and release indoor heat from the hearth. This asymmetry really shows an understanding of thermal flow, even though they didn't have any formal theory about it. Now, here's how this technique silently reduced fuel consumption in winter. Firewood was labour, plain and simple. Every log represented time, risk and energy spent gathering it. A house that lost heat quickly demanded constant feeding of the hearth. Charring reduced that demand. Walls stayed warmer for longer, and roof beams resisted moisture infiltration that would otherwise sap heat. Modern reconstructions that use untreated wood consistently report higher fuel usage than historically accurate builds that incorporate charred elements. This difference becomes critical in prolonged winters when resources tighten. How the same method protected Viking tool ships and storage buildings. This was not limited to homes. Charring appears on tool handles, boat ribs, near the bilge storage racks, and even grain bins. In ships, lightly charred planks resisted microbial growth in damp conditions. In storage structures, charred posts prevented grain loss by deterring insects and mould. The technique required no rare materials. Fire, timing, and attention were enough. That accessibility made it widespread and resilient across regions. So let's talk about how modern builders and survivalists can, actually apply this knowledge today. This method honestly remains practical. Things like fence posts, raised garden beds, shed foundations, and off-grid cabins, well, they benefit immediately from charring. The process itself is simple, but it really must be controlled. You just expose the wood surface to flame until it turns uniformly black, but you don't want it to crack. Then allow it to cool and brush off any loose char while leaving the hardened layer intact. For ground contact, charring only the buried section actually mirrors Viking practice and, believe it or not, significantly extends the service life. In cold climates, using charred siding on windward walls improves moisture resistance and thermal stability. And in survival shelters, even lightly charring the internal support poles reduces condensation, drip and rot during extended occupancy. This is not cosmetic. It's, structural insurance drawn from centuries of trial and error. Why this quiet technique explains how Viking settlements endured those brutal winters. The Viking world, you see, was not held together by mythic strength or reckless courage. It survived because of quiet decisions made with fire, wood and experience. Charring was not dramatic. It left no ornamentation. It simply worked. That is why it persisted. When later builders abandoned these practices in favour of untreated lumber and, faster construction, buildings failed sooner. The old knowledge had been lost, not because it was inferior, but because it was subtle. Understanding this technique really does reshape how we interpret Viking resilience. Their success against winter was not accidental. It was engineered. If this exploration of forgotten craftsmanship deepened your understanding of how historical knowledge still applies today, subscribe to In the Beginning. Share this episode with fellow history and survival enthusiasts, and help keep these quiet, powerful techniques alive for future generations.